Hello and welcome to the Hoop Collective podcast. We talk about the NBA, and we are doing so on Friday afternoon on the East Coast. Hope everybody had a good 4th of July holiday. Joining us on their holiday weekend from, I believe, are you in New Orleans right now, Andrew Lopez, or are you in San Antonio?
I am, which is kind of funny because I thought by moving to San Antonio, I wouldn't have to track hurricanes anymore. But I have my eye on this. But I am in New Orleans for the weekend, and then I don't know, maybe driving back to San Antonio this Sunday. I don't know. Who knows right now?
Well, good luck with that, and good luck to everybody in Texas who's watching that hurricane. Joining us from Los Angeles, California, is Youngmisuk.
What up, guys? How was your 4th?
It's the NBA transaction game has slowed down. I think we were able to enjoy a little bit of downtime. It was still some things going on. In fact, just before we did this started recording here, Franz Wagner agreed to a 5-year max contract extension, $220 million with the Orlando Magic. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the team you spend the most time covering, the LA Clippers. They had obviously an eventful first week of transaction season, losing Paul George, signing some players. What has been your read on where the Clippers are as a franchise after the developments of, you could sort of see the Paul George thing was sort of a slow motion car wreck, but where do you think the franchise is at this point?
I mean, I think they were scrambling, even though I scrambling might not be the right word, because I think they've known and seen this coming for a while, that Paul George could very well be gone. We kind of this was put into motion basically since January 10th, when Kawhi Leonard got his 3-year, $150 million extension, and that same night Paul George was kind of optimistic that he would get one. But I mean, that Kawhi extension kind of almost came out of nowhere, and it certainly felt like that night was a watershed moment for the franchise, because they felt like, hey, we got this superstar in the summer 2019, and now he actually wants to stay here and take less than the max on an extension. And what a moment for the franchise and Steve Ballmer to celebrate. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, I think they offered Paul initially less than that, and everything was downhill from that point on, where Paul wanted a 4th year and Clippers were not willing to budge. And I think what we've seen in the aftermath is a lot of people wondering why the Clippers would just not give him that 4th year. And, they were definitely afraid of this second apron. I think they saw the ramifications of a rule that they feel has been built for them and the Warriors, basically.
It was
to curb their spending. And so their argument basically is that if they had given Paul that 4th year and a max contract, it would have severely hampered the way they could build out this team. But not just that, get those guys help when they need to. Eventually, in the 3 years, they would need to get these guys help, because all 3 guys, James Harden, who's on a 2-year deal, but Kawhi Leonard and Paul George are they'll be in their mid-30s to late 30s. And they just felt like they would not be able to get any other younger talent to really help those guys out. So they decided, we're not going to give Paul that 4th year. And the other thing too is, I think another thing that people are overlooking is that I just don't think they were going to go above what Kawhi Leonard got. They just were never going to go above that to give to Paul. I mean, if you looked at it the entire
that's
time,
what I'm asking you. I know what their reasoning is. I'm going to ask you whether you buy it.
I do. I do. I just don't. And I don't think they, I think if they had their choice, they would have brought Paul George back and ran it back, because I do think they feel that this coming season, with those guys back, they would have had a chance if things broke their way. If they stayed healthy, and that is a massive if, because they've never been able to do that. But if they were able to stay healthy, there wasn't one dynastic team they would have to go through. Other teams would have had injuries. They could have had a chance, especially when you looked at that stretch where they went 26-5. They probably felt like, hey, we'd have James Harden the whole camp if we had our guys healthy, and Kawhi's a big if. We don't know how Kawhi's health is going to be. He's been in the gym working out, and the plan looks like he's going to be there with USA Basketball this weekend and next week, and we'll see how his knee is with that. You always have to look with Kawhi Leonard. It's not the day that he works out or plays. It's always 2 to 3 days later after that how he reacts. But I think they felt if they brought everybody back, they could make a run. But now that Paul's gone, I think what you've seen, I think they've gone a little too heavy on defense. I think they went out and got a lot of defenders. I think they saw that, hey, one of the massive improvements we made was we got Jeff Van Gundy as our top assistant. Jeff Van Gundy, obviously, is a defensive guru. We haven't seen Jeff Doe coach in a very long time. But if you look at Jeff's record, Jeff's defenses are always excellent. Let's go and get a bunch of defenders. I think they don't have enough offense now, especially if Kawhi is not going to play every night. And I think they do have to load manage Kawhi Leonard. I think they got to go back to that this season because it didn't work last year. Obviously, I think playing him in all those back-to-backs early on, remember, he started that season playing like 26 straight games. I think they're going to have to hold him out of back-to-back games. James Harden, is he capable of, carrying the offense on certain nights? Yeah, but I don't think it can be on an every night basis because I think last night I think he's a great playmaker now at this stage of his career. I think he can light it up on certain nights, but I don't think he can carry the load all the time. You have a wild card that they brought in and Kevin Porter Jr. We're going to have to see how that works out for them. It's obviously a big PR risk for them, but the guy can fill the basket up. And then they still have Norm
They don't
Powell
seem
right
to care
now.
that much about PR risks.
Terrence Mann. No. I think they've always looked at those things where they said, hey, we got to be able to find talent where we can get it at talent that we normally can't get. It probably is going to be at a risk. And they'll say like, hey, he's in a program. We're going to have zero tolerance policy with him. They did it with Josh Primo last year. This one, I think I think you're elevating the risk factor with Kevin Porter Jr., obviously compared to Josh Primo.
So here's my opinion based on what I know. I think what the Clippers are saying is what is called in poker a semi-bluff. Like when you're playing poker, sometimes you're making a bluff. You still have an okay chance of making your hand, and you it's not a straight bluff because you still have a chance to win if you get called on it, but it's known as a semi-bluff. I think what the Clippers are describing this as a semi-bluff, and the reason I believe that is because, and Zach Lowe has brought this up. It's a little disingenuous to say you're worried about the apron when you had a contract offer on the table for Paul George that would have in fact taken you into the apron. And I know that, yes, if their argument is, well, if we had given him the 4 years, we would have been in big trouble with the apron 4 years from now. You only were giving James Harden a 2-year contract. You knew that's what you were going to give him. That's what you were willing to give him. That's what he was willing to take. If you'd given Paul George 4 years, you would have had Harden off your books in 2 years. And you could have spent 2 years looking for a cheap replacement for him, and you wouldn't have had to worry about the second apron in the 4th year.
But let me counter that. Counter that. How would Kawhi feel? We don't know this question. We don't know the answer to this. How would Kawhi feel if Paul got more money and more years than
this
him?
Is why I'm saying that the apron is a semi-bluff.
What about also? Who is going to be a free agent in that 4th year? If you were to give Paul a 4th year, who's coming up in the 4th year or even in the 3rd year? Who could the Clippers go big name free agent?
I don't know. How can
I think personally they are going to try to maintain flexibility to eventually reload and try to go after and I'm not, for the aggregators out there, I'm not saying this like I'm breaking news. I'm saying this as I'm throwing it out there. This is my own idea. That they would go after a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or an Anthony Edwards when they come up, whatever. Luka, you know what I mean? I think they're going to try to maintain that flexibility.
I don't think you can plan 3 years in advance on free agency. I don't think that's a way to run your franchise, and I don't think that's what they're doing. I think they just didn't believe in the team enough.
I mean, they did kind of plan things out a little bit for Kawhi. They're prepared to try to go after Kawhi well in advance before, but
not 3 years. Agent. Not 3 years when they had a team that was, loaded. So yeah. I just, I don't know. Like, by the way, I'm not taking a position that they acted wrong. Like, I'm not saying that they screwed up. The way they may win the same amount of games next year as they did this year. Who's to say that an increased role for Terrence Mann won't work? Who's to say that Derek Jones Jr. coming in there will not be a really good addition, right? Like, who's to say they won't make another move, right? Who's to say that Harden and George or Harden and Kawhi without Paul may be more efficient with each other. They may be able to increase their production because they're not sharing it. I'm not arguing, that the Clippers have made a catastrophic mistake here. They may end up looking okay in this. I'm just rejecting that it was all about the second apron when their other commitments, when their offer would have taken them at the second apron. Because it's not like if Paul George said, you know what, I will take the 3 years, $150 million. Then they would have said, oh, actually, we just did the math and that takes us into the apron. So we're not going to take it. We're not going to take it.
No, I
They're
think
just,
maybe
they're using
I think
that
when
as
they
a,
say
as a
second apron,
semi-bluff excuse.
I think when they say second apron, they're probably fine with second apron with Kawhi and Paul together. I think it was that fourth year.
Like I said, they would have 3 years to figure that out.
Right. And then I think normally, and I've always been on this side, is you pay the player the money and you figure it out later. I just don't think, I think with
they
this
had been doing that. Maybe they're just done with it. And that's a reasonable thing too. I understand they can't say that. So maybe that's what they came to. And they're just like, well, we can't say that we're just tired of paying these guys. You know, we can't say that we don't think that this mix is worth it anymore. We can't say that we think that doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results is crazy. We can say that it's the apron. And so I think they're just, I mean, it's not that it's not the apron. I'm not saying that that's no reason. I just think that excuse is not the correct word. I just think that it's doing a lot of work and the fact that they had a 5-year or a 3-year offer undercuts that they were that worried about the apron. That's all I'm saying. What do you think is going to happen with Russell Westbrook?
Well, it certainly looks like they're trying to get Chris Dunn. And so obviously that would give them 3 point guards. If you James Harden, Kevin Porter Jr., Chris Dunn. And so Russ, obviously they got to find a place for Russ. And I think that's probably what's been part of the reason why there's been a holdup with the Chris Dunn thing, is I think they're trying to work something out and see what else they can do. Because I think 2 guys it looks like they would try to move would be PJ Tucker and Russell Westbrook. And of course, there's a lot of noise about Russell Westbrook potentially with Denver. And so that might make sense in the standpoint where if you look at it and you think, well, is Russell Westbrook really going to fit in with Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray and those guys? Well, to me, there's a Nikola Jokic, Russell Westbrook, and DeAndre Jordan all have the same agency. So I think from that standpoint, they probably would try to make it work out as best as possible. If Russ could get to Denver, we'll see what happens there. But I think the Clippers are trying to find suitors to see what they could do with, PJ Tucker and Russell Westbrook as well.
Well, PJ Tucker basically didn't play for them at all last year, so that doesn't affect them. Russell Westbrook did play quite a bit last year and played reasonably for a bunch of the time. There were some nights where it didn't work out so well. Why do you think they're moving on from Russ? It's very clear that they are, but why do you think they are?
Well, I think if you look at how they paired Russ, and from the get-go, one of the guys they always felt comfortable pairing Russ with was PG. And so when they moved Russ to the bench, a lot of the thought process was, when we kind of stagger guys out, we're going to stagger Russ with PG, because those two obviously are friends and they played the best together and their talents seemed to work together. And so with PG gone, I think also that, I'm not saying that's the big reason why, but I think that was one of the reasons where you could see that would be an indicator that, hey, what are they going to do with Russ next season? So, and I think the playoff finish was also, everybody struggled at the end of that playoffs. Nobody looked good in the end, but Russ certainly had his struggles in that first round. So they seemed ready to go in a different direction. And like I said, I mean, if you're going to go with like a Chris Dunn, who I think they've always kind of liked in the past, certainly I think they like his defense. It just feels like they're building around a team that is going to be able to defend. But to me, looks like it's going to have to win a lot of games in the low 100s.
Well, they do have a very good coach who can coach to that. I believe in Ty Lue, although I think that the way they played last year by playing all those guys and not worrying as much about the load management was a Ty Lue driven thing. I think that's the way Ty Lue wanted to coach, and that's one of the reasons why they went that way. So we'll see how that goes this year. Mr. Lopez, the New Orleans Pelicans have had an active offseason as well, trading for DeJounte Murray. As of right now, they have no starting center. What do you think about the DeJounte Murray acquisition, and what do you think they're going to do about the fact they have no starting center with Valanciunas going to Washington?
Well, I'll say this. I was surprised at first when the DeJounte deal happened, and it was not for Brandon Ingram. I thought one of the iterations of
I
that
can speak to
deal,
that.
one of the
I can-
iterations of that deal was
I can speak to that.
was Brandon
The
for
Hawks-
DeJounte and
yeah.
Capella, and then that obviously didn't go.
The Hawks weren't interested in taking Brandon Ingram. Sorry, go ahead.
So I knew they were shopping around that Larry Dyson pick package that they ended up using. EJ Liddell got thrown into that because it got him in the
Larry Nance Jr., Dyson Daniels, the young guard, and EJ Liddell, and 2 first-round picks. That was what was traded for DeJounte Murray. Just to be clear. Sorry.
and they're going to have to do something else. That because of the timing on this, originally they got this deal done prior to the year to I think it was officially it came down June 30th or whatever it was. The idea was get the trade done then, but it would have because of DeJounte's trade kicker, which is the largest trade kicker in the NBA.
Do you know how much it is? I can't
total.
remember.
I think it's $12 million total.
Right.
Um,
So the Hawks have to pay that,
correct.
but it goes on to the Pelicans' books.
The
And it
number
goes-
is bigger. Yes.
Yeah, and that going on to the Pelicans' books in the 2023-24 season wasn't over yet. So if DeJounte had come onto the books with that trade kicker, it would have pushed the Pelicans into the tax. And that is problematic on a couple of fronts. One, they actually have to pay tax on the amount of money that they're over. Secondly, when you're a taxpayer, you don't get the disbursement of all the other
Right.
tax dollars, which I think was over $10 million.
Yeah, it was like 12 million.
Okay, so that would have cost them probably in excess of 15, 18 million.
Correct.
So they decided not to do that trade until after July 1st. I assume it has to be by July 6th. We're in the moratorium now. So I guess tomorrow it'll get announced.
Correct.
Or I guess when this podcast posts on Saturday or whenever. So that's just to explain that housekeeping.
Correct. And there's going to be some sort of addition. There's a couple of avenues that they have there. One being the Jonas Valanciunas deal that he did with, I believe the Wizards is coming in at 330. So his first year is 953. They have a couple of exceptions, including the Monte Morris exception that JV could possibly go into, and they can take care of that. That's one avenue that I know New Orleans
So
is
again,
looking
just to
into.
be clear, because we move past it kind of fast and people get confused. What the issue with the trade is that with the new salary that DeJounte
Right.
Murray
It's like
has,
28 million coming in, 19 million going out.
the trade doesn't work as constructed. They have to add a player to the trade to balance out the trade. So a way
About 2.3 million has to be added from New Orleans in the deal.
They could have done it in the last league year, but in this league year they can't.
Right.
And so as a result, they have to alter the trade a little bit. And so what Andrew was saying is that Valanciunas is going to sign with the Wizards. They could do that as a sign and trade and take Valanciunas into a trade exception or just into cap space and send the Pelicans back a trade exception, which would enable them to complete that trade. It would be in a 3-way transaction, I'm sure. It would make them complete the trade. But I think Washington would want something they don't.
Right. To make this happen. And
so they're gonna have to throw a
second,
sweetener.
something's down there.
Right. They're gonna have to throw a sweetener Washington's way.
And
And that's if they decide to do that. There's a few other ways they can make this happen still.
Yeah. I don't want to just race past it. Go ahead,
As somebody who covered Brandon Ingram and likes Brandon Ingram a lot, and I understand the money is a lot too, but I've been a little surprised that he doesn't have much of a market. Like that teams aren't really looking at, especially like teams that are like rebuilding. I mean, I get like a Charlotte and San Antonio maybe has been mentioned along with him, but like Brandon Ingram's a really good player. He might not be a max player. He might not be a guy that's going to carry a franchise, a guy that's going to, score big buckets at the end of games, but he's a very, very good player. And I feel like I'm been a little surprised that there's been so many teams that just don't want to have anything to do with it.
The market for Brandon Ingram.
I don't think that's it, but Andrew, go ahead. I want to explain, but go ahead.
No, because the market for Brandon Ingram is you're not looking at the market for Brandon Ingram as a 1-year player at 36 million. The market for Brandon Ingram is he's looking for 4 years, $208 million. And I think that's where the market has kind of gone down a little bit to not many teams. And also, I think there's a few teams right now who what happened with Paul George? That's going to Philly. Boom, that's knocked out. What happens with Lauri Markkanen? What happens with DeMar? There's other things that are going to figure it out. And then maybe in a week or so, then we'll see a market for Brandon start to kind of increase. But it's not that, okay, yeah, we don't want to pay Brandon 36 million next year. It's, do we want to pay Brandon Ingram max contract money? And I think that's what teams are kind of starting to kind of figure out. And that's why there's not this large market right now for Brandon services.
Right. So
but, I mean, look,
yeah,
if he doesn't get, if teams don't want to pay him the max, then he's not going to get the max. Right. But like, you look at like Franz Wagner, and I get it. Franz Wagner has probably more upside because he's younger, but I mean, like Franz Wagner got a ton of money, and I get it. Orlando has to pay him because they want to keep this young core together and everything like that. But I still think like Brandon Ingram, I'm not saying Brandon Ingram's a really good player that I think if I was like a Charlotte or San Antonio, I'd love to have Brandon Ingram.
Yeah, and I think that New Orleans is also in that boat too. They're trying to weigh out of, okay, we're going to have a Z extension. We have CJ's money for 33 the next couple of years. We're going to have Herb Jones is already on an extension. Trey Murphy is going to cost a pretty penny when his extension gets in. So they have to worry, how many big contracts can we handle, and can we handle a $50 million deal? But I think if Brandon were to take a lesser deal for New Orleans in the, say, 170, 160 range, New Orleans would be just as fine keeping him around. But going back to Brian's original question of them not having a center now, because you've lost Jonas Valanciunas to Washington. Larry Nance is a part of the DeJounte Murray deal. Cody Zeller was your third big this year. You bring in Yves Missi, who has a lot of potential.
He's a project.
Exactly. He is a project. You don't probably want him being your 82 game starting center next year. So the cleanest way, I think, at this point for them to get a starting center is still probably to look at that Brandon Ingram market. And I think they're going to continue to do that and see, maybe what that could bring them in terms of a starting center.
Yes. Let me discuss Brandon Ingram for a second. It's not that people don't think Brandon Ingram is a good player. It's not that people don't want to trade for Brandon Ingram. It's that he is a poster boy for the new reality in the NBA, which is you cannot have a max player not playing like a max player. And that sounds like a pretty basic terminology and a pretty basic rule that you would always want. Like, what team wants to have a max player who doesn't play like a max player? Well, there's quite a few of them, actually. Like, let me give you a classic example. Michael Porter Jr. has a max contract from the Nuggets. When the Nuggets gave him that contract, they knew he wasn't their first or second best player. They were comfortable with him being their third best player. And with hope that he would grow into it more, but like, they gave him that contract knowing that. Andrew Wiggins, a few years before that, when they gave him that contract, they weren't sure he was ever going to be like a perennial all-star. But it was like, okay, we're going to bet on him. It's very hard to do that with this new apron environment. Like, you cannot have, I talk a lot about the third salary. If you have two max players, your third highest salary, you got to be real careful there, because if you have three max players, you really are really squeezed. Those three maxes better be kicking tail. Like with where the 76ers are, Embiid, Maxey, and Paul George better be awesome. And, with the way Ingram played this last year, and he was good 2 years ago. He was injured a lot. And that's the other thing. I'll point this out too, Lopez. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Ingram has missed an average of 25 games. Well, I guess maybe it's not 25 because some of the seasons were shortened. He's played an average of 57 games over the last 7 years. He misses games.
Yeah.
For a bunch of different reasons.
Yep.
He didn't have a great year last year. He was good. He shot 49%. He averaged 21 points. He shot 36% on threes. Like, he's good. Like, he's a guy who can be a point forward, distribute the ball. He put the ball in his hands. He's actually better that way. He can do a lot of things. But he didn't have a good year, and he missed 18 games. And it's just right now, it's not on the palette for teams to trade for him when everybody knows that he and his very powerful agent are going to want a max. And so it's not that Ingram isn't desired as a player. It's that they don't desire the circumstances, especially in this moment in time.
I guess what I was saying was I wasn't advocating for him as a max player. I was more saying like under the understanding that he's not a max player and thinking that price is eventually going to go down.
If you're Brandon Ingram and you believe in yourself, which you do, and I spoke to Brandon last year. He was on Team USA last year. I spoke to him about how he was offered an extension last year, a max extension, and he didn't sign it because he thought he could make the All-NBA team and get a supermax. Yep. So this is a guy who believes he can be a supermax player. And now you're saying a year later, by the way, after he goes for 21 points and shoots 50%, like, he probably thinks that his usage could have been different. Lopez, he probably doesn't. He's not, I'm just saying, like, he's not in the mode to be taking a discount right now. And his agent is not in the mode to take a discount either.
He's still a guy who, over the course of his time in New Orleans, averaged 23, 5, and 5 over the last 5 years. He was, he's made an All-Star game. He was most improved a couple years ago.
Right, he's 26. It's not the time to take what you think is potential less than your value. And so teams know this. It's not that the teams don't want Brandon on their roster. They just don't want that. They don't want a player who thinks he should be getting a super max or absolutely a max. That's what they don't want.
One thing that's maybe problematic in kind of the eyes of some people right now of how they see Brandon, the last time you saw him was not the best version of Brandon Ingram. And the last time that you saw Brandon was a Brandon who maybe came back a little early from a knee bruise and was probably maybe 80%
That was a rough injury, man. That was a really upsetting injury, the way that happened.
In the playoffs, I remember everything was starting to click for New Orleans. Brandon hits it in Orlando, suffers a bone bruise, kind of avoids any ligament damage. But when he came back in the playoffs, it's okay. He comes back, I think, for the last regular season game. Okay, they look like they're trying to come back against the Lakers in the play-in. Zion's hamstring goes, and now Brandon has to do everything or be the number one guy offensively. CJ's doing what he could do. Herb could do what he could do. Trey, all that kind of stuff. But there's no extra help. Brandon's probably, he's definitely not 100% at this point. He's not going to make excuses for it, but that was a hard injury to come back from. Lou Dort was they were allowing him to be very physical in that series, and he got to do everything he wanted. And Brandon was definitely in the torture chamber. It was not a very good look. However, when you're coming out of that, that's probably the last thing I think that people remember right now about Brandon. Not the fact that two playoff series ago or 2 years ago in the playoffs, he was maybe one of the best players on the court when they were playing the Suns when the Suns were the number one seed. I think he averaged 27 or 28 in that series. He is still that level of player. It's just kind of like, as Brian was saying, I think there's because of rules right now, I think there's just not the appetite right now to maybe go out and pay him the 4.208 right now. Maybe as we see how some of these other teams shake loose, what happens with Sacramento's interest, what happens with Cleveland's interest. There's some other teams out there, but figure all that out, and then maybe we'll see what shakes with Brandon, in a couple of weeks.
All right, a couple more questions about the Pelicans because they're a team we don't talk about, but they're kind of they're a fascinating team right now. Trey Murphy is up for a contract extension. Franz Wagner, we just mentioned, 2 years or 5 years and $220 million. The same draft class. Scotty Barnes also got a max in that draft class. Cade Cunningham has not signed. Evan Mobley has not signed. But if I were the two of them, who were top 4 picks after seeing Franz Wagner, who is a player who is, high upside player, but did not have a great third year where there was big expectations of him to have a really breakthrough third year. He was fine. His shooting percentage plunged. He could not make a three.
36 to 28.
Yeah, 36% to 28%. Not what you'd expect. He did average 20 points a game, shot the ball well inside the arc, but a little mild surprise, especially in this environment, that he would get a max. But if you're Cade Cunningham and Evan Mobley, you're like, excuse me, if Franz Wagner is getting a max, I'm getting a max. So that's just, I think they probably were already there, but this will just embolden them. Trey Murphy is part of the same 2021 draft class. There's a couple other players in this draft class who will have interesting negotiations. For example, Jonathan Kuminga up for an extension with the Warriors, Alperen Şengün up for extension with the Rockets. Both of those guys are going to want probably big salaries because they're looking like impressive prospects. Where do you think Trey Murphy is going to come in at? I think this has got to be a priority for them, Lopez. There's a bunch of teams
100%.
in the league who would love to have Trey Murphy, and he's been off limits in trade talks.
Yeah, and it's when you do ask around and everybody, what about Trey? What about her? Well, those two guys aren't going anywhere. You've probably got better chances with the rest of the roster, but I would think Trey's going to come in. I would think 25 to 30 a year. Is that?
I think you're low.
Probably.
I think you're low.
With with Franz, I mean that's a big one.
I mean, like Jaden McDaniels.
I think that's the deal that kind of is like where I start. And that was what 5,150.
Yeah, his salary is. I mean, also, Emmanuel quickly got 145. I mean,
I feel like he's in the 150-ish area. You can get the 5 years now because of how the deals are set up, with the change in the last CBA. So I think you're in that range. I think obviously Trace, they see some of these higher numbers, but I mean, he is a guy who he battled a little bit of injury. Like he battled some injuries last year. He had a really good 22-23, was kind of coming into his own a little bit, had some spot star, or was a starter most of that year because of the injuries. Took a step back last year, but it's still a guy who's one of the better shooters in the NBA. Shot 39%, shooting 39% for his career from three. Real range to 28, 30 feet, can really help space the defense.
By the way, 26 million is what Jaden McDaniels his average salary. So I would think, just for various reasons, he's going to want a little higher than that.
Right. So that's why that's where I think I got the 30 from. Like that's probably where I could see it coming in. He's working. The spacing that he provides is the Pels are one of these teams. I know a lot of these teams do it now. The Spurs actually had the line out the other day. They basically tape or paint on a 4-point line on their courts in practice. What would be a hypothetical 4-point line that's basically 3 or 4 feet behind the 3-point line, and you can work on spacing that way. He's out there doing it every day when you go to practice in New Orleans. I think that one of the other reasons that you can look at a potential Brandon deal is if you're paying Brandon, would you rather pay Brandon $52 million, or would you rather pay Trey Murphy whatever he's going to be? Obviously, he has one more year before that extension kicks in. A potential Brandon deal would, in theory, slide. If you're going to go do this deal for a center, let's say, could potentially slide Trey Murphy into the starting lineup, and provide, Zion with a little bit more spacing than what they've had in the past. So I think it's going to be an interesting deal. I think in the 25-30 range, but we'll see where it ultimately comes in.
I would think he'd probably try for even higher than 30. What he gets is another thing, but they got to be careful.
They're definitely going to try for higher than 30. I know that.
They're just the CJ McCollum contract. This is what I mean by the third salary. And it's a little bit ironic because CJ McCollum, as the president of the union, negotiated this deal. But this is kind of what I'm talking about. So obviously the Pelicans' number one salary is Zion, $36 million. He makes a few $100,000 more than Brandon Ingram at $36 million. And CJ McCollum is at $33 million. Well, CJ is a quality player, but is he a $33 million player in this environment? I don't know. He averaged 20 points a game last year. He shot the ball
ninth
really
straight
well
year. I think he's averaged 20 a game, which
he's a great offensive player. He would probably argue that he's a good value at that deal.
Yeah.
I don't know.
hit 239 threes last year in 66 games.
Yeah, he had the best 3-point shooting season of his career. I mean, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. So I don't know. Maybe people would say that that's not a thing, but it causes you some pause when you have that. And like, that's one of the reasons why the Pelicans can't extend Ingram, because they got McCollum on their books. And if they extend, when they extend Murphy, he'll be on their books. And then you potentially have 3 players making 30 million, or 4 players making $30 million. Just the Pelicans can't do that. That's just not what they're going to do. They've never paid the tax. So you start to understand. So let me ask you this. And all these challenges, by the way, I think they're a good team. And they, like there's some players that, I mean, if Zion stays healthy for the whole season, I know it's a huge if. I shouldn't assume that, but like, there's no reason why they're not a top 14. Maybe not just a top 16, but a top 14. One more thing, Lopez. The Trailblazers have 3 starter level centers, assuming that you think you can start Donovan Clingan. Maybe you can't start him right away, but they have DeAndre Ayton, Donovan Clingan, and Robert Williams, who they acquired from Boston in the Drew Holiday trade, and he'll be back and is working out. He was a sometimes starter, sometimes off the bench guy. It seems like they've got one extra center, and New Orleans doesn't have any centers. It seems to me like those 2 teams could do business.
It would make some sense there, especially when you look at a guy. If you want to start with Robert Williams is from Louisiana. Would be a little bit of a homecoming. He's from kind of the Shreveport area. Went to North Caddo High School. Remember covering him in a state championship or state semifinals. Robert Williams was shooting threes all over the place. It was a very different Robert Williams than the Robert Williams we the Time Lord we know and love today. But another thing about that is if you do look at DeAndre Ayton, who would still potentially pose some of the same problems salary-wise long term, you'd have to very much be comfortable with that if you're New Orleans. But Willie Green did spend some time in Phoenix, and was around DeAndre Ayton at some point. So it's that one does it makes sense. I still think, to me, Cleveland makes sense. Once they figure out where they're going to go with the Garland, the Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell backcourt. Once Mobley gets his extension, what does that look like for Jared Allen? I think that's probably something that New Orleans has kicked around for quite some time. If they can figure that out, to me, that's kind of where some things just kind of keep going back to. But Portland does on paper make a lot of sense, because if you have an extra center, and I know a team that needs an extra center right now, and they are definitely still looking for one, especially as the free agent center market is drying up a little bit more rapidly, I think, than what they thought, even on guys who could just come in and be, the 11th, 12th guy on the roster, as Yves Missi is still trying to be a project and not, getting thrust into action right away.
Yeah, so the Pelicans have some work left to do for them. They're potentially 2 significant deals, but at least one deal they're going to have to make. So I know there's a lot of focus on other teams, but two teams I would say that if you work in the NBA and the conversations I have every day with people in the NBA, 2 teams, I wouldn't say these are the only teams, but 2 teams that the conversations are about. Well, there's some with the Jazz, because there's, there's uncertainty with Markkanen and how they'll spend their cap space. They still have cap space out there, and teams have to spend to the floor. They're required to spend a certain amount of money. Sacramento, Sacramento has been tied into a whole bunch of significant name players, including Brandon Ingram, including Kyle Kuzma, including Lauri Markkanen. Like, they've been attached to all these players. They have some draft picks that they can trade. They have Harrison Barnes, who has 2 years and about $37 million left on his deal. They have Kevin Huerter, who is coming off a shoulder injury, but he's got 2 years and about $35 million left on his deal. They have Trey Lyles, who's an expiring contract. So they have some, Barnes and Huerter have some value, and they do owe a first round pick to I think it's a lottery protected or maybe top 10 protected. I should know. I don't know off the top of my head. Pick to the Hawks, but they do have future first that they can give. So they've been kind of having discussions with an indication that they want to bring in another significant piece as their sort of third salary. They have De'Aaron Fox on a fund max for 2 more years. He is electing not to extend his contract this summer. I think it's because he thinks he can make the All-NBA team, potentially be a supermax player. I wouldn't necessarily talk him out of that. But Sabonis, his new contract kicks in this year. It's $40 million. So he is not at the max and Fox is at the fund max. So they technically have room to add a significant salary. So, but people in the league talk about the Kings, what they're going to do, talk about the Jazz, and they talk about the Pelicans. So that's why I appreciate you saying that. Oh, and one of the teams you pay attention to a lot and spend some time with is the Denver Nuggets. The Nuggets obviously lost Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. They have not been able to make a significant addition to their roster at this point. They did trade up in the draft for Deron Holmes. Calvin Booth has basically indicated that Christian Brown will be the new starter at 2 guard. And you mentioned they've been attached to Russell Westbrook, although I think that's a backup play. But where do you think the Nuggets are at this point?
I mean, I can understand if their fans are a little frustrated because losing KCP is such a critical piece to what they do. I mean, he does all the dirty work. He obviously was perhaps their best defender, obviously a 3-and-D guy. And so now, we've been talking about Christian Brown now for a couple of years about his potential, and he's played great in spurts. And now he's going to be thrusted into that role to basically fill that spot. And I think he probably, obviously KCP is a 2-time champion, right? So those are big shoes to fill. But I think Christian Brown, I think they like him a lot. I liked what I saw from him at the end of the season in the locker room after the game. When they lost, I got to say, Christian Brown might have taken that loss harder than anybody. And that was a very proud team that was not ready for their season to come to an end and how fast it came to an end. Remember, because they had that collapse in the second half.
I wasn't ready for it.
Yeah. Christian Brown, look, I mean, there were moments where I think he was, there were tears in his eyes. He took that one really hard. And I think that's the type of guy you want to see, a guy that wants it that bad. So, a guy who
he's used to winning championships.
Yeah,
his last 2 years he hadn't been eliminated in literally years.
And now look, let me talk Westbrook a little bit. Perhaps I can see, look, the shooting is not really there. Like if you envision like Nikola Jokic throwing a corner pass to Russell Westbrook, and the corner 3 is probably Russ's best 3, but it's not exactly what you envision. But losing a guy like KCP last year, quietly, Russell Westbrook had perhaps his best defensive year individually of his career. He was a top defender 1-on-1. So perhaps they think we get a guy that's athletic, that can defend, a guy that brings energy, a guy off the bench, a guy who can push the pace, a guy that can rebound. I think maybe they see some potential in that. It would be funny because he would be replacing another former Clipper backup point guard in Reggie Jackson, who they just shipped out. But they need to add a couple guys because knowing Michael Malone, one of the issues last year was they went away from veterans like Jeff Green, Bruce Brown, and they decided to go with some of these younger guys that Calvin Booth wanted to groom and draft. But Michael Malone was still very much in a, I trust veterans and I want to win now. So We'll see what comes up this coming season because it's shaping up that the guys like Strother and things like that are going to have to start stepping up and get more playing time.
They didn't re-sign Justin Holiday or Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. So basically they're going to sign Westbrook maybe, but basically what Calvin Booth looks like he's doing, and their transactions aren't over yet, but looks like Calvin Booth is saying, I'm taking away your veterans to Michael Malone. You've got to play Brown as a starter. You've got to play Peyton Watson more. You've got to play Julian Strother more, their first-round pick from last year. That's a tale as old as time. The general manager takes away the options for the coach and forces them to play the young guys. So that also could be what's going on. Where the where the Nuggets need help is, two-way wings, and they've got a bunch of them sitting on the bench that Calvin Booth, went out and acquired. So
Unproven, but yeah, I mean,
yeah, of course. And that's why Michael Malone doesn't want to play him.
Yeah, Peyton Watson, I think, is going to be a good player. I do think he needs more minutes. It's just a matter of Michael Malone trusting these guys. I mean, maybe they go out and we'll see what happens at the end of free agency and who's available, and they find a couple other veterans to fill out that roster. I mean, I find it very intriguing if they do end up with Russ, how that would look like, because that I think that would be a very interesting fit.
Yeah, like they've even got they had a high second round pick that they traded for last year, Jalen Pickett. He barely played. Yeah. But I'm sure that Calvin Booth would love to see him play more, right? Like, your replacements are sitting there. So play.
I mean, look, Strother had a great preseason last year. I mean, at one point I thought with all the threes he was hitting, I was like, oh man, this guy might be pretty good. But I also kind of knew, like, Michael Malone plays the starters very heavy minutes and, does not trust a lot of guys coming off that bench. So we're going to have to see how they fill out the rest of the bench and what's going to happen next season.
I keep saying this and no one seems to be reacting, but Jamal Murray is still not signed his extension. Aaron Gordon is extension eligible later this summer. So just going to point that out. All right. Lopez, your team where you live, San Antonio, with the giant pickup of Chris Paul.
Mm-hmm.
He took him. I've been saying this. He was not a free agent for 20 years. He was never a free agent. I guess maybe his contract expired in Phoenix and they re-signed him. So I guess technically he was a free agent there, but he was never actually like out on the market receiving other offers. And he was a free agent for about 5 minutes.
I was going to say it was 20 years and 20 minutes. That's probably what it was.
Obviously the Spurs had indicated they were interested in him and they come to an agreement 1 year, $11 million. This isn't a semi bluff like I was talking about earlier, but it's maybe it's a semi bluff because this is the Spurs improving without question, improving their weakest position, which is point guard, and them doing it with a Hall of Famer, but also not doing it in a major investment they will have for years. Like, you can go to Victor Wembanyama and say, Victor, we just got you one of the greatest point guards of all time. Look how we're upgrading the roster. And that's a true statement. But also at the same time, it's not like it's a lock, stock, and barrel move to like find a running mate for Victor for a long time, which is what I think, is going to be needed. It will make them better, but I also think they're still going to be a lottery team. Unless you think Victor's good enough to carry them maybe into the play-in. But what's your feel in there in San Antonio with the Chris Paul transaction?
It's not a move necessarily for 24, 25 Victor Wembanyama, but more for down the line Victor Wembanyama, even if this is the only season that Chris Paul plays in San Antonio. It's one of those moves where it's about what can Trey Jones learn, or what can Stephon Castle learn, what can Devin Vassell learn. All these guys are going to pick up all these things from CP. Victor's going to pick up things from CP. And how is this going to be a long-term move? They've kind of kicked the tires a little bit on maybe some other guys, but I think they're still just in a, one thing that GM Brian Wright has said over and over again is this is still going to be a brick-by-brick process. And I don't think Victor's going to be, even if Victor's even playing at the level that he was playing at the end of the season, when he was averaging 23, 12, 4 or 5 blocks a game, and still shooting pretty good. I don't think they're going to be in a position where they're going to be, a top team for Cooper Flag next year. I think they will be closer to the play-in than they will be to the top of the lottery. I don't necessarily know if they get to the play-in yet, without making some other moves. But I see this as a win for San Antonio because of what Chris Paul is going to bring, I think, to them as an organization and what some of these other guys are going to be able to learn at this point. If Chris Paul is at this stage of his career taking this 1 year, $11 million deal instead of trying to go chase a minimum deal with, either of the LA teams where his house is, or trying to go look at a ring right now, he is kind of at least bought in on this, helping out and teaching in this kind of next stage of what he's going to do. So I think it's one of these things that while there will be I think a positive on court reaction to this year, I think this is going to be more about what this is going to mean longer term for some of these guys, including Stephon Castle and Victor Wembanyama. Stephon Castle, the number 4 pick in the draft this year.
Don't you think though that Chris Paul is going to come in? Yes, he probably agreed to all those things you said, but he's going to try to make the play-in. And
yes,
at what point
I just don't know if the other things that they have done at this point takes them, because at this point all they have done is they've lost Cedi Osman, who's a solid 7th or 8th guy for them last year.
They haven't lost him yet. He's not signed anywhere.
Well, he's not anywhere yet, but he's not on the roster yet. But all they've done is really brought in Chris Paul, Stephon Castle, Harrison Ingram, their 2nd round pick. That's really it. If they make another move, okay, I think they can.
Well, they're compelled to, because they're still below the floor.
Right. So, I think that could be where, if one thing that they did do before July 1st was that's when Devontae Graham had a guarantee date on his contract. He is another 10, or I think he's guaranteed for 2.89. His contract's about 12.9 or 13 million. So that can take care of a little bit of that in terms of if they just want to have him on the roster, and he can be a tradable number if they want to go that route down the line. But if they make another move, I could see them being closer and trying to be there. But I now, a team that was 22-60 last year is, maybe they could push for 35 wins, but we just watched the Houston Rockets go 41-41 last year and not even make the play-in. So you have to be very, very, you still have to be a very good team, I think, to make the play-in in the West. And I don't know if 36 wins, 38 wins get you there next year.
Yeah. Well, they're going to be a fascinating team to watch. I think Chris working with Victor is going to be, you're going to have a lot of fun. I suspect you're going to be writing and talking about it throughout next year. Because Chris he's no nonsense, but he also does what it takes to win. And if what it takes to win is to feed Victor 55 times a game, he'll do it. He will take 3 shots if it makes the most sense. And, Victor will have an ally. I think that's something he's going to be, looking for. So definitely Lopez, one of the more interesting moves of the summer.
I think Wemby's going to have a big year next year. I think he's
taking a big year this
step
year.
Forward. But I'm talking about from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah,
I am definitely taking him early with my 1st round pick if I get drafted high. I think he's
I think you're going to have to be very
notch.
high in that draft to make sure you get Victor Wembanyama. You're going to have to be really high in that draft to make sure you get Vic.
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch Victor play for the French.
Yes.
In the Olympics. And
the alley he had against Turkey the other day, where he almost hit his head, I was like, yes.
Turkey. We don't call it Turkey anymore. It's Turkey now.
When he almost hit his head, I think Batum threw him that. Batum, I think he was also, in the mix to come down. I think if the Spurs would have somehow gotten Chris Paul and Batum, they would have gone from the youngest team to the oldest team just on those 2 moves alone. They wouldn't have needed anything else. They could have kept the team the same as last year and just gone from youngest to oldest. But Batum wants to go back out west. That's cool. But that was a nice hoop that he threw the other day. I think it's going to be fun to watch him, and all the things are going to be there with this lineup.
Just in case you forgot what Victor's numbers were his rookie year, 21.4 points a game. And remember, his scoring was, I want to look and see what it was after the All-Star break. Well, hold on.
It was 23 after the All-Star break. It was like 23-5, I want to say, or something like that. I feel like I've written out enough that I feel like I know, but I'm going to double
21
check it.
points a game, 11 rebounds, 10.6 rebounds, 4 assists, 1.2 steals, 3.6 blocks, which led the league. So in the stock stat, which everybody loves, steals and blocks together, basically 5 a game.
Post All-Star. 23.5 points, 12 rebounds, 5.3 assists, 4.5 blocks a game. That's post All-Star in 2020.
But not
And
even
how many
post
steals?
All-Star. It was really like the last month, right? That he kind of turned it on even more.
He
I
did.
mean-
He had a really good, I mean, January he had, 25, 13, 7, almost, more than 5 blocks a game, but he only played like 5 games in January. It was really kind of like January on is when he really started to take off, I think, where the shooting started to come around. I think that was the other thing, is the fact that he shot, a lot better post All-Star. I mean, this is still a guy, look, triple double with blocks, triple double with assists. We had the 5x5. I mean, he is going to challenge for an All NBA team next year, especially because, and I think he was in some people's conversations this year if the team's not 22-60, but he is going to be in the conversation for, top 15 player easily next year.
Let me see. Over his last 15 games, he averaged almost 5 blocks a game. Good luck, folks. It's going to be, I've instituted a new rule, Lopez. I declared it already. People are going to get tired of hearing me say it. There will be no ceilings put on Victor Wembanyama. None. Not right now. Maybe at some point, year 3 or 4.
I
but
agree.
like somebody says, no, he's going to average 40, 30, and 17. I'll be like, well, I have a rule. No ceilings. No ceilings. All right. Well, thanks, guys, for spending some of your holiday weekend with us. Thank you to Jackson, our producer, who's doing the same. We'll be back with you on Monday, more on our regular schedule with the Tims. Bontemps is out in LA. I'm sorry, he's out in Vegas today for Team USA. Their players are reporting today on Friday, and we'll meet the media on Saturday. So there'll be a lot of stuff to talk about by Sunday. And McMahon will be, doing McMahon things. Okay, thank you for listening and watching Hoop Collective. We'll talk to you soon.